All right, it looks like we are live and good to go. Let us go ahead and get going on World Building Wednesday. So this is the Wednesday right after OnCon, which was an online convention I ran last weekend, thus the previous sentence. And during that, we did a world building session and came up with this world around with the idea of islands floating in the sky, tethered to these islands in the ocean, these floating ocean islands that are sort of draining resources, and that where there's this clockwork mechanisms on the island, but these sort of oppressed agrarian societies on the sky islands and the various things going on there. So this is our world building document that I've reworked since we did our world building session at the con. I took all those notes and just sort of reformatted them, rewrote them somewhat to be, I think, a little easier to parse through. This is actually a useful trick for world building, is to recognize that what you write during a brainstorming session doesn't have to be the same notes you keep forever. You can obviously store those notes, but you can then rewrite those over time to better sort of clean up your thoughts and make it more organized and easier for you to remember. So we have these sea islands floating up there. We have those. We have sky islands floating up there, sea islands down there in the water. The sea islands, the ones down in the ocean, are more clockwork focused, so they have more sort of mechanical contraptions. We want this to be sort of late medieval, early Renaissance level technology, so nothing too crazy. So we need to think through kind of what that would look like and what stuff we'd get out of that. And I'm still trying to figure that out. We'll dive into that here in a second. Sea Islanders live these matriarchal societies with multi-generational families in the same house. So you can think in Japan was kind of the model here, and we're talking like Edo era, Tokugawa era Japan, classic samurai era. So you have these houses with multiple generations living in them. There's a head of the family, and so generally speaking, the eldest child then takes over at some point from, in this case, the matriarch. But you have multiple generations living there, and you kind of stay there. The classic Ie of Japan, which should be noted, just kind of for historical purposes, was an ideal, wasn't necessarily exactly the way everyone lived all the time. So this is actually a disclaimer I'll throw out right here. Any sort of world building that takes real life as inspiration should be understood to not be a precise representation of that real world culture. We're drawing ideas from real life and popular imagination about real life and history and so forth. So do not consider any of this to be, real culture in that sense. So that basic idea. And so you have these households. We imagine that adolescents basically form bonds and get married around late teenage years, but they just stay in that household as essentially dependents of the matriarch until that matriarch dies or retires, and that's usually when the next in line is somewhere in their 30s. So you have these interesting kinds of power going on there. This also implies some things. If we do have clockwork mechanisms, we can imagine houses that specialize in this, where every generation is learning how to build these clockwork mechanisms, and they get better and better at it, and all of this sort of knowledge is being passed on generation to generation. So I'm going to add something here. Sea island households are often effectively mini corporations. specializing in various aspects of clockwork, manufacturing, and other, I want to call just kind of specialties or other industries. Right? So it's not just, not everyone is making clockwork all the time. So you can think of these as being like, that family is similar to Sony in our world, or similar to Apple in our world, where they specialize. They're known for producing really high quality X, whatever that happens to be, and that makes sense to me. Interesting. The sea islands are fairly large. We agree they're about the size of the main island of Hawaii, on average. So you're gonna have cities and towns and so forth. Probably one big city, and then a variety of towns and villages. So that will allow for a good amount of specialization for each family. You might have a family that specializes in clockwork or a handful that specialize in clockwork in every town, and then a good number in the main city. And we have this stratification of society, which again makes sense. If people are specializing by household, then you have some households where they clean the streets, and others where they are manufacturing really high-end clockwork mechanisms, or they're crafting wooden boxes or staves or whatever that are highly prized and looked for. And that also relates to possessions. So one idea we had in here is that because society is kind of straining at the seams in terms of resources, land is very precious, which is why you have these sky islands producing food. The possessions are generally more owned by the household. So, blankets, tables, things like that are owned by your family, not by an individual in that house. People will have some individual, even your clothing might be more, the family's clothing than your own personal clothing, and it can kind of trade it around. Particularly, I'm sure when you're a child, your children would be trading clothing a lot, and but you may have a few personal possessions, maybe a knife, maybe a necklace, etc. And those would be very, very precious to you and very special. Okay, so the question then becomes, what does a clockwork sea island city look like? What do habitations look like? How industrialized are we talking about for this society? And obviously, I don't want to go too crazy on this, and it will vary from island to island, from society to society. The thing is, it's fantasy, and when you're doing fantasy, it's kind of nice to be fantastic, right? To do something that is different. So I kind of like for that to be remarkable. I'm wondering if we can make the households themselves interesting. If households are in, like, say, multi-story buildings, and so you have kind of sky rises in the sea islands. We're talking wood and brick and stone, but still going up multiple stories and being these sort of mini factories. I kind of like that idea. Let's go with that for now. So I'm thinking maybe let's just add something here. Sea island cities are typically multi-story, filled with multi-story buildings, each housing one family. Most families most buildings, I want to have the idea that not every building is a habitation, but some may be warehouses or other storehouses for the families nearby. I don't think it would be difficult to make this geographically tied down, where if you have a family with two warehouses, they are adjacent buildings. It's almost impossible to run a city that way, to have that level of technology. You know, you're going to run out of space and you need a warehouse. You're going to build it, 3 blocks away because it's the only land. So I'm thinking each house, housing one family or serving as a storehouse. For a family. Families generally live and work out of the same building. They generally live and work out of the same building. But more successful ones will have storehouses and such throughout the city. So I don't think this would be a society. Again, land is valuable. You're probably not going to see a shop separate from a house. The first floor of the building is going to be maybe essentially shop space. A typical arrangement involves a shop on the first floor, storehouses in the basement, and I'm going to first parentheses ground floor because I'm American. Storehouses in the basement, work space on the second floor, and the family living on the third floor. Arrangement for an upper middle class family there. So the wealthy might have 4 or 5 story houses, right, and large large arrangements, but and a poor family might all live and work out of one floor and one building, but that's a common setup. Cool, I like that idea. So then the question becomes, what kind of public buildings do we have? You'll need arrangements. You'll need religious buildings, governmental buildings. If we have fairly complex, again, sort of medieval, late medieval, early Renaissance societies, you're going to need a fair amount of government. Do people, is that a hereditary, our hereditary institution where that is another, big building where the people live and work there who are government employees for life, basically? That seems weird. It seems odd. And I don't think so. So we have these matriarchal societies. We'll say most towns are run by a town council. Makes sense for this more communal society that meets in a public meeting hall that is large enough for most, that also serves the community at festivals, public gatherings, etc. So it's some large space, right, that the community uses. Cities are typically run by a bureaucracy. I can never spell bureaucracy. Bureaucracy? Nope. Bureau, yeah, because of bureau. A bureaucracy that works out of a city hall that is more designed for government work. So it's less of a meeting hall than a set of offices, essentially. And that kind of fits this idea of a tightly a tightly communal society. You'll need some central spot where everyone can meet and work, but in a more specialized way for individual functions, right? So if you're going to meet to talk about, I don't know, imports of metal, then you're going to go and meet with particular people there. You don't need some one large hall with lots of people all working at once. A lot of clockwork is used here. So I imagine this to be highly mechanized, so to speak. Cool, that makes sense. There are also, let's say most settlements are built around temples, shrines, temples/shrines. So in other words, there is usually some holy place in the city, town, village, which is the center of it, and everything kind of spreads out from there. In other words, it's not something on on the outskirts of the village. It's not something separate. It is the heart. In fact, we considered the heart of the town/city, and are most always in their center. This gets back to that religious idea that settlements kind of centered around these holy places, and then people built out from there, as opposed to settling a place and then creating a place of worship. That's interesting and kind of different. It's kind of a steampunk type setting. Not really. It's more clockwork punk, if you will. Steampunk implies kind of Victorian era technology. This is more late medieval, early Renaissance level technology. So clockwork mechanisms, think the Mechanical Turk, think dolls with clockwork in them, but advanced enough to the point where they can actually be useful. So as an example, you might have a wooden clockwork mechanism into which you put seeds, and that, and you wind a spring, and it moves along a field and spreads seeds from it, right? And it can work an entire field with this clockwork mechanism. You just have to set some levers maybe to say, okay, this is the number of this is how wide it is based on how far you move this lever. This is how long it is based on how far you move this lever, and you let it work that field. You might similarly have robots to water things, stuff like that. So it's not magitech necessarily. It's all conceivable clockwork. It's just pretty advanced, but by the standards of clockwork we typically have today, or we have in regular society. So it's more that, and we do have to figure out power behind the clockwork. Again, I'm thinking kind of springs, other reasonably natural things. We do have magic in the world, but magic, we know magic is new. So I don't think we would have clockwork that is generally powered by magic. I don't think that is the common way to power clockwork mechanisms. So again, springs make sense. Although we could certainly have resources in the world that serve as a form of power, and that are magical but are not part of the traditional magical system. So they're not, you can't take this and use it and cast spells with it. We can use it to power things. We can see, so kind of power stone kind of technology things, or a calcum kind of idea. But that's still undecided. It's a good question, and let's just say, what powers the clockwork mechanisms? Worth figuring out. Yeah, I don't think they're perpetual motion kind of mechanisms, although I imagine they are more advanced than what we have today. So they're not going to go for 2 minutes and then stop, right? These are springs that could go for hours at a time. Especially for these sorts of farming equipment and things around the house, that kind of thing. So again, I can imagine a mechanical Roomba, right? A little device with a little sweeper on it that just bounces around a room more or less randomly and sweeps up into a little collector in it. It wouldn't be as compact as a Roomba, but it could be kind of R2D2 size. And maybe you just when you leave for the day, you set that out and close the door and leave, and it just wanders around your house sweeping up. And then when you get home, you pull out a tray and empty it. You could have mechanical messengers. So one could imagine there would be some kind of like line painted on the streets of cities that clockwork mechanisms could see and interpret. So they have some kind of crystalline eye which reflects white but doesn't reflect other things and can be used. And so you tell it, okay, go out of this house, and when you get to an intersection of lines, take a right, take your first right, and then go down past 8 intersections, make a left, right, and so you could potentially do things like that. So I'm gonna write that down actually. Crazy idea. Delivery clockwork uses white lines painted on the roads and can be programmed to make deliveries by following those lines. And again, they may not be common. That may only exist on 1 or 2 islands. But that's the kind of thing. I think it's a good compromise between unlimited use and short, almost useless duration. Yeah, exactly. So let's just say that actually. Clockwork power source, and again springs question mark, last for a few hours typically. Yeah, I think it's a good, again, and you'll have little children's toys that may only last for 10-20 minutes before they have to be rewound, and you may have giant government clockwork mechanisms, something, for example, powering an actual clock that may go for a month, right? Because it's not doing too much, it's just moving this one thing slowly over time, and so it can just kind of go and go and go and go, and then it has to be rewound. So, yeah, I like that idea. Thank you, Patrick, for bringing that up. All right, so, but exactly what powers it, we can think about that later. Let's move on to the Sky Islanders. So again, these are agrarian communities. They're colonies, essentially, up in the sky. The land is used almost entirely for farming, for food, for the Sea Islanders down below. In return for that, they get fresh water and other supplies brought up by clockwork mechanisms that go up these giant ropes, basically, that tether the Sky Islands to the Sea Islands, which I just love the visuals of that. So what would that look like? I'm going to grab some water here real quick. These are tribal settlements. Leadership could be patriarchal, matriarchal, but it's based on some kind of test with children raised more or less communally. So a highly communal society could have relatively few buildings, or the buildings could be, again, all communal. One big sleeping hall, where just everyone goes in and sleep, and that could be a general meeting place as well. And then, storehouses and other places that are used for those things, but very little in the way of like personal space. Of this is your house, your house, your house. And that would also kind of fit in with the idea of a colonial environment where you're shoved up here and it's empty land and you got to cultivate it. You need some kind of buildings to house things and to sleep and so forth. But your first priority isn't going to be to build a two-story rambler, right? It's going to be very functional houses, and that could, again, sort of expand over time. So Sky Island towns are usually made up of communal buildings. A communal sleeping hall, storehouses, workhouses. Workhouses isn't the right term. I'm thinking like, you know, a general workspace. Work buildings, etc. And again, you have like your blacksmith, forge, weaving, etc., etc., etc. So that would work. Grain milling, yep, totally. Forge, mill. Think medieval. So you have your mill, your forge, your church, your and there's another difference. What else would you have in a typical village? That's kind of what comes to mind, because the mill is used both to mill grain and usually to bake bread. We get the idea. There is also a temple shrine somewhere near the village, the town, but separate from it. So again, we have this idea that you arrived here, your first priority was setting up something very practical, and then you consecrated a holy site. Excuse me. So there's some holy site that you found and consecrated, but it's kind of away. It's and it could be 100 yards from the village, but it's not the center point of the village. In fact, it might even be some distance from villages. Let's say that. Temples, shrines, temples. That actually difference. There is usually a simple temple structure nearby, and shrines out in the shrines a large distance from settlements. Again, since there's not going to be much wild space, it's going to be all farmland, but there could be orchards and such. So I don't want to say out in the wilderness, but yeah, and actually temple might not be the best term. I'm thinking just a simple huts, a simple place where people gather. Usually a simple, maybe they don't have temples. A simple shrine, a large, will be a few simple shrines far away from any settlements, and religious ceremonies happen in communal spaces. So there's no temple, but there might be religious ceremonies. There might be the weekly sermon and so forth, just done in the sleeping hall, or wherever are those areas. Religion is important, but not central, a nice departure from standard medieval structure. Yeah, exactly. So I'm thinking more like reverence for nature. You go out and you pray, or you revere your ancestors or whatever out in these holy places, but it's not. And you may be very religious, but you don't build edifices to that in your settlement. Again, because you don't have the time or resources to do that. So that could be an interesting thing as well. I also wonder how much the architecture is determined by the sea island. How much does the sea island try to impose its culture on its sky island? Classic thing, if you're setting up a colony, you want it to feel like you want to remind the people there that they are part of the sort of dominant culture. And this isn't necessarily doesn't have to be a terribly Orwellian thing. It can be one of those things where, hey, we all came from this sea island. We consider ourselves members of the sea island. We're just colonists up here. We want to remember what home is like, and we want to all kind of feel as one. And the sea island might say, hey, yeah, you're colonists up there doing your thing, but we want you to feel like you're part of the country. So we want there to be this feeling of sort of central culture. So I'm thinking that might be, again, architectural. Let's start there. These buildings are usually required to copy the architecture of their sea island origin, sometimes to absurd degrees. So I like the idea that the sleeping hall may have to look like the town hall, right, or the city hall, in miniature, or in the way you put certain designs on there, every building has a carved snake over the lintel on the sea island, and so they replicate that on the sky island, even though there are no snakes. Cool. Yeah, lowest impact, highest benefit, and you do it once, more or less, and it's there for decades. So yeah, I like that idea. The land itself might be the edifice as well. That's true. If you're a colonist and you're farming this land, you may see yourself as almost an interloper who is petitioning the gods for success, for good harvest, and so forth. So you have this respect for the land that maybe the Sea Islanders do not, or they see in a different way, right? They just they're not as dependent on the land in that same way. So let's just say that religious beliefs center more on respect for the land, and honoring it. Religious ceremonies, and focus more on respect for the land than do Sea Islander ceremonies. We still have to define what a lot of this looks like, and it should be pointed out, I am spending a lot of time here defining differences, partly because we are bouncing from culture to culture, and that's how you define culture is what makes it different. As time goes on, we'll also define some of the other similarities between cultures. Worshipper whose worship is working the land respectfully. Yeah, absolutely. Working the land is often seen as a form of worship. And that can create some nice synergies and some nice factionalism where there are ways to pray respectfully and ways to pray disrespectfully, and that way of farming the land is dishonorable to it, right? And you can get into all sorts of interesting debates over this is a new way of doing things that pulls more that is more productive, but it's not the way we typically do things. So is that right or wrong? I like that a lot. Good idea, Patrick. Okay, so I think we had this idea of and we'll say, etc. And we'll say ringing a large open space. So just to be clear, we have this ring of buildings, and again, it can be not necessarily a ring of single buildings. It can sort of spread out with some large open space in the middle. They are generally single purpose, used by large groups of people at a time, and then they generally copy buildings that exist on their respectful sea island. Respectful? No, respective. Thank you. There we go. And religious things are more about the land, with some small shrines, to the land, out away from settlements. That feels nice. It separates worship from the Steve Frank people as well, and gives them, to that point, it gives some factionalism there, where the Sky Islanders say, look, there's those Sea Islanders, they don't get down on their knees to pray, so clearly they're not, really believing. They don't believe in gods at all. We're the right ones. We do it right up here, and all that stuff. Cool. Indeed, the worship of the Sky Islanders may be more about getting on your knees, getting on your hands and knees, getting close to the ground. Stuff along those lines. Cool. Okay. So I like that. I had some questions about magic. And we're already in the Sky Island. So we had this idea that magic was discovered fairly recently. We should define how recent that was, i.e., is it within the past couple of decades, couple of centuries, right? I think a generation is too soon, because then there's not much lore around it. There's not much to discover. There would not be much for people to find out. No old dusty books and that kind of thing. But I think 1,000 years is far too long. So I think a few generations makes sense. Let's just put down here 100 to 200 years ago? Question mark. That general scale feels right. 100 years minimum allows for some flexibility. Exactly. So we'll start there. And kind of nail it down a little bit more. And magic is more powerful the higher up you go, like into the atmosphere. But it's also based on currents, so it flows all over the planet. And if you're in an area where it's flowing very strongly, your magic is more powerful. Magic is also unique to the individual thus far. So I may have magic power, but it's more about giving me strength, right? So I can do Drunken Master style. I can punch people and really hurt them. Whereas someone else doesn't do anything for them, but they can start small fires or punch up an existing fire, whatever. Very distinctive. So magic users live in these small cloistered communities, mostly on Sky Islands, because again, magic's going to be more powerful up there. And so if they want to research and learn their powers, they want to do it as high up as possible. And these communities work with outsiders, but they keep to themselves, partly out of a sort of idea of company solidarity, where if we don't tell them exactly how we use our magic powers, then we can keep the mystery, we can seem to be more powerful than we actually are, and we can be more useful to society in general. So the question is, what does that look like? Is it going to be learned, or is it an innate ability? We think it's an innate ability at this point. But however, importantly, there are relics that allow you to cast magic through them. And so some people use those to cast magic. Some people also masquerade as having innate powers, but actually they just have a little, stone in their pocket which they touch, or whatever. So we think there's that level of magic use where it's based on an artifact, and then there is innate magic use, but I don't think it can be learned. I don't think there's a scroll rod idea in there, unless the rod is an artifact, a relic of the dragons, for now. In fact, let's just point that out. Magic so far cannot be learned. And part of the reason for that is we want magic to be rare. We want it to be fairly uncommon. And in a world with limited resources, we figure you would have people trying to learn magic constantly. And with, everyone living sort of shoulder to shoulder, information is going to pass pretty quickly. So it's going to have to be fairly innate. Or it's going to have to be innate. So then the question becomes, if you have these cloistered communities, and the obvious similarity here from the real world is monasteries. But monasteries were built by people who were trying to live a very particular kind of lifestyle, i.e., they were trying to be more like Jesus, they're trying to be more like the Buddha, and live in these very specific ways, and then found ways of doing that that were then useful to society. If you actually read the rule of Saint Benedict, or the other rules of the monastic fathers, there's this interesting balance there, which I don't want to get into in too much, between saying, we're here to live a life that is very centered on our religious beliefs, and that is all about those religious beliefs. Like, we're not worried about, making money or about any of those other sorts of things. We're worried about setting up routines and rituals that are all about, these religious practices. But also, we live in a world, we exist. There is, evil and suffering all around us, and we should not stick our fingers in our ears and pretend that doesn't exist. So we should have some impact on society. Anyway, point being, that doesn't really fit with this. So it's a great point, Patrick. I think the idea of a university makes a lot more sense. And indeed, early universities were just groups of scholars, where if you wanted to go to university, you would go to a particular city and find the scholars who lived there and say, I want to learn from you. And you would pay them, and you would go to their apartment, essentially, their rooms, once a week, twice a week, where they would tell you what they knew, and they would lecture you, and they would, maybe give you something to research or whatever, and then you come back, and it was this thing. So yeah, school, I think, makes a lot more sense. Which means you don't necessarily have a physical monastery. You could be a magic user who lives in a town, and again, you are just passing that on to people. But if we have these very tribal societies, that becomes hard. So maybe there is a separate space for you. Maybe magic users do go out and find a spot where they kind of live and do their thing, but they're not separate from the tribe. So maybe it's one of those things where, kind of like a workhouse, once magic users are identified or settle on a sky island, perhaps they go and they say, okay, we're going to find a little grove or a little spot or some place where we can go and sit and learn our stuff. But we're still part of the tribe, right? We're still members. We still come back and eat and sleep with everyone else and all that kind of stuff. So that makes sense. Okay. Users work in gather and learn from each other in cloistered communities, mostly on Sky Islanders. In designated spaces, Sky Islands. They work with outside, yeah. Keep right to that. Think university rather than monastery. Medieval university. That's cool. And so a larger, more successful Sky Island might have a building set aside for magic users where they go, they do their research, they cast their spells, whatever. But they're still, yeah. However, magic users simply work in this designated place, space. They still eat, live, sleep, etc. with the rest of the tribe. So you can also think sort of shamanistic culture, where the shaman is still a member of the tribe, is still there, is still takes part in things, but also kind of lives apart to a great extent, and has his or her own mystic spaces where they go and do their magic. In fact, crossed with village shaman. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, cool. That works. All right, magic is tricky in world building. Absolutely. And it's why I like this idea that magic isn't done in purpose-built, wizards' towers, right? Because that has all sorts of effects on society. Instead, it's, hey, I'm like a blacksmith. I go over to this one spot where I need my stuff, and I do my stuff over there. But I'm still a regular member of society, generally speaking. I can just do cool things, but there's also this sort of almost like the kind of a Freemason society, Freemasonry around being a magic user, where we have these special rituals that we do, and all of these initiations into things, of which 75% may be just pure hocus pocus. Well, not really hocus pocus, but maybe just purely invented to separate oneself from the outsiders, from create ritual and this sense of distinctiveness with no real magic in it at all. Cool. All right, so there's that. We have a few other questions. Merfolk. So I wanted to nail down Merfolk. How far have we been going? About an hour. So let's think a little bit about Merfolk. Minerals in the society, we decided, are and metal is very rare, and would not be found. Certainly, you could not do much mining on the Sky Islands, because then you just it would crumble away, and you're going to have limited supplies on a sea island. I mean, you can do a fair amount. There is some limited mining on island nations, but we love this idea that we have this water race that not only mines these metals, but provides it to the human society in this sort of cartel fashion. The human society cannot get metal except through them, and metal is useful not only for just general tools and so forth. Really advanced clockwork requires metal. For all the classic mundane reasons. It can be very fine and such, where you can only get so much out of wood. So we have these merfolk with this uneasy relationship with humans and with islanders. The merfolk have these patriarchal societies with essentially nuclear families, but that have these strong relationships between clans, with sort of pods for these families, which makes sense. Again, there can be some interbreeding, but it's rare. We had this really neat thing, which I want to think about a little bit more, perhaps not today. The Merfolk consider that their creator is a sky father, who banished them to the sea. So the Merfolk used to live on the land, but their god, sent them to the sea for some reason, and so they no longer worship that god. They tell tales of it, but their religious ceremonies really do not venerate or honor that god. I love that for the conflict it creates, for the potential for story that comes out of that. The Merfolk have this chip on their shoulder against humanity, which may be completely invented or may have something true about it. There may be something real. It could be that the Merfolk used to live on the land. Perhaps they could. They were a different race and they got pushed out. Who knows? There's also the possibility that magic existed way back. That humans and Merfolk could cast magic, but it was lost, perhaps. Settlements around mine, places to rest, grab a quick bite, sleep, working, back to work. True. I was actually watching a documentary last night about volcanoes, and it got me thinking and looking around at things. It got me kind of inspired. It turns out most deep sea mining occurs around volcanic vents, because that's where metals from deep in the earth get pushed to the surface. it's very hard to mine underwater because imagine swinging a pick, 100 meters down, right? It's just very hard to dig and to get into soil. So I imagine you'd have volcanic vents where merfolk get in, and they could do, again, some kind of mining and work on things there. But that would be kind of the major way of mining things. So I love this idea of a relatively dangerous work environment. And I do agree that they would have settlements around that, near these volcanic vents. The question is, so some element of the settlements will be protective as well. If you're living near a volcanic vent, you need some, fairly thick walls of your settlement. So I love that, Solari. But what other purpose do they serve is the question. If you have the whole ocean and you can kind of walk around and go anywhere, you have escape from predators, right? That makes sense. So they may be more defensive. They may be more like fortifications, really, than houses, right? Similarly, again, you can kind of sleep anywhere technically. It's not going to rain. It's not going to sleet. You have a pretty consistent environment. Then you'll have hot and cold currents and such, but they're not going to do a lot. Centralized meeting places for the cartels. Great point. How does trade work? Great question. Let me add that. How does trade work? So I think we're definitely deciding. Merfolk generally settle near volcanic vents where they do their mining. They construct, and we'll say they have more more organically shaped buildings that serve mostly to protect them from volcanic eruptions and predators. Built in, I'm almost thinking like spheres. So you have either cylinders or spheres made out of coral or what have you, or rocks, kind of like castle towers or such, and they're clustered to form different buildings and such, with some kind of big central dome or tower there. Mining camps for work and separate settlements for families, government. Good point. That could be there as well. Especially if the volcanoes are fairly dangerous, that makes a lot of sense. So, settle in, generally live, this is interesting, in two places. At mining camps near volcanic vents. Merfolk will live for weeks or months in spherical, cylindrical buildings that protect them from volcanoes and predators. Live for weeks. We'll say weeks, months, or even years. There are also permanent settlements established safely away from the volcanoes, and are far more ornate and beautiful. This is also where permanent settlements. This is also where metal is stockpiled. That's a great idea, Patrick. So we have the sort of, again, work areas around the volcanoes, but people may live there. In fact, let's even just say months or even years. People may more or less live there permanently. So in other words, I don't want this to be kind of one of these like work sites where you're sent there, you work for a while, then you come back. You may have families there, for long periods of time. Um, and that'll also depend on kind of your rank in society too, I think. So if you're high up there in society, you may just be sent there occasionally to work to sort of, do your part. But if you're poor, you may have to live there your entire life, basically. Coal mining being the obvious, comparison here, where, you owe your soul to the company store, and you're working there every day until you die, which will be fairly soon. Since there are seasons, maybe there are work rotations. Yeah, years in rotations, work rotations, living in spherical fortresses. Actually, I'm going to call that. So yeah, I love this idea that the mining camps are basically these constructed areas which are there really for defense, for hunkering down in, for storing things temporarily, eating, living, all that kind of stuff, and then you ship everything out to the beautiful undersea, Phantom Menace, beautiful underwater city kind of places that benefit from all of the mining, right? So that's neat. So we now have kind of a working class versus an upper class society of Merfolk. That's neat. That's really cool. We also need hunters, fishers to get food from miners. Very good point. I think that's going to be hunter-gatherer stuff. You're probably not going to have a lot of hunter settlements out in the ocean. Maybe a few hunting stand kind of things, but or hunting lodges, but nothing no large scale people living there. Hunters also travel in pods, catching fish, sharks, etc. You might also have, and we could play around with all the fun D&D tropes around, pet sharks that serve as your hunting dogs, right? Or riding on giant seahorses and that kind of fun stuff. Merfolk wouldn't need to, but you can also imagine a merfolk saying, well, hey, you can swim 3 times as fast as I can. I'm going to ride on you. So we might have that as well, but I don't want to nail that down just yet. That's a good idea. So yeah, we really should probably call them fishers. Fishers. Fisher, yeah. Cool. That works. So I think that's where you have settlements. So how does trade work? So from a purely functional perspective, Merfolk haul it up to the surface, onto a beach somewhere where they are met by people who give them stuff in return for the metal. What do Merfolk need? What would they want? You have the obvious, jewelry, baubles, pretty things, and that could also be where the why those underground cities look so pretty, because you pull out a pearl, then they go back and fashion that into something, very special, carve it in a very particular way. So you have a lot of coral necklaces, things like that would be highly prized under the ocean. Because those processes would be harder to do underwater, all that pressure. What else might there be? Items built from yeah, exactly. Coral-based armor. Merfolk trade metal for what were we saying? Coral-based armor, coral-based trinket, jewelry. Undersea volcanic forges. That is actually awesome. Ooh. Dang, Patrick. That's even better. Yeah. So here's what we'll say. And actually, that kind of makes a certain amount of sense. So one of the things I'm also struggling with is the question of, let's say, let's say you pull metal out of the ocean floor. Let's say it's iron. It's being exposed to seawater. It's going to rust immediately. Now you could have a hunk of rock with a vein of iron through it. The iron around it's going to rust, but the core will be usable. But the idea is if iron is kind of surging up from the bottom, and kind of exposed in these volcanoes, the idea that you could kind of grab that, pull it over to your forge, and immediately start forging it into some kind of metal, and then you had some process to temper that in some kind of rust-proof system, in some into some kind of rust-proof metal, some kind of alloy. That would be amazing. Merfolk can have volcanic forges that they use to forge the metal forge certain kinds of metal that come out of the depths, come out of the volcanoes, and can be and that they can make rust-proof. So maybe it's like precious metals that they can't work with. Maybe surface dwellers need weapons from them. True. But then why work with the surface dwellers at all? There must be something they want. Now, one of the ideas is that so magic. Remember, magic is more powerful the higher up you are. So magic's going to be very rare and very weak under the ocean. Another thing that got me really inspired from this documentary is the idea of having the volcanoes being symbolic of the power of hell, of demonic forces, devils, things like that, evil spirits. It doesn't necessarily have to be like hell, but it can be the idea that there are cursed souls are inside a volcano. Slighted gods live inside a volcano. That kind of thing. So that could be. It could be that they feel that they're working kind of a devil magic, a kind of unholy magic, in that sense. So I like this idea. And they can make that. They can make rust-proof through devil magic that comes out of the volcano. So let's just say, just straight up, that the Merfolk have some kind of access to these special powers that come from being near the volcano, that are being pulled off of this cursed god, or these ancient spirits, or whatever is surging up from this volcano. And that's what they use to rust-proof their weapons and do other kind of magical special things to their weapons. Okay. Do they need humans to purify them in some way? Does the devil magic curse them in some way that needs purification? And again, it doesn't have to be like devil magic. But perhaps that very process is damaging, and they need some kind of thing that only the surface dwellers can give. It could also be something about their diet. So it could be that Merfolk, because they were cast out, can't actually live on a pure aquatic diet of seaweed and fish, and maybe they need rice. Maybe they need fruit and vegetables and things like that. That would be kind of interesting. And it could be one of those things where a Merfolk can survive without them, but they still crave those things, right? They wouldn't be happy without access to those things. Spices, yeah, totally. Okay, so this is making some sense. So we're gonna say because Merfolk still need Merfolk oddly find a straight diet of undersea vegetation and fish insufficient, or at least extremely bland. Most of their trades with the land dwellers are for fruit, vegetables, grain, meat, etc. And for certain expensive crafts that are much easier on dry land, right? So there'll be certain certain things you can make on dry land that are just going to be harder to manufacture underwater, under pressure, and so forth. And it may be just, it turns out that, certain human, families have been manufacturing these for years and have really specialized in how to make these certain things. And so while Merfolk can technically do it, these folks are better at it, and so they trade for that. Just complete mundane specialization. Yeah, totally. In fact, I think for spices, fruit, vegetables, grain, meat, etc. That's cool. I agree. I think spices might be central. I think it might be they mainly need it for spices, salt. Not salt. But yeah, spices, peppers, that kind of thing, just to season their food, make it not bad. You do get the weirdness of how you season something underwater. Although you can brine things, certainly. That'd be interesting. But yeah, that would totally work. You could just, create basically a spice rub, and then encase that in seaweed or some other thing, and that would infuse that potentially. Although they're already full. Well, whatever. Fantasy, right? Not going to worry about that one too much. Medicine, true. Oh, that's a good idea. Oh yeah, medicines. That would make a lot of sense. There are certain things where, certain vegetation where as soon as you get them wet, all of the medicinal properties just leach out of them. So they have to be prepared on land. Yeah. That must be prepared on land. Fruit, vegetables, etc. I'm going to remove grain and meat. Oh, we'll keep meat because again that makes sense. You can get that wet. But yeah, I love the idea of that. That's really cool. Totally makes sense. Now the question of how it works in the sense of like trade routes and things. You're gonna obviously have some merfolk that just trade individually, where just, if you row your, there's some islander who rows their boat out to this one spot, and a merfolk comes up, once a week, and they trade stuff. But there'll also be, central trading areas. So let's say most islands have I imagine some kind of beach or shallow area where people can wade out, and that have stone areas set up so that somebody can essentially sit like neck deep in the water, while a merfolk can swim up, and they can engage in trade and kind of move things back and forth. And then there will be other parts of that where folks, merfolk can drag something up, somebody can wade into the water and pull that all the way out. Have a and I'm not up on my sort of island terminology to know what that would be called, or that would be what that would be. Let's have a an area on the shore of their largest city where for merfolk trade. Merfolk swim up while islanders wade neck deep into the water for formal negotiations and merfolk and goods are traded in bulk, whatever. That makes sense. So it's just, I'm sort of imagining this, you have a city and you have these various buildings, and then there's a two-thirds circle sort of beach, and it may be essentially constructed, built over time, that comes out from this part of the city, and it slopes down fairly drastically, and there are stones set in it. And maybe one side has these very stones, the other side is more or less plain, and so business people will wade down, merfolk will swim up to say, okay, we're buying this for that, and then on the other side, workers are dragging things in and out of the water for trade. That I think makes a lot of sense. The water fortifications and goods are dragged in and out of the water in large quantities. Cool. I think that defines it pretty well. Nice. All right. Obviously, there are other details here, but I think that gets us going. We now have, what is this? 3.5 pages of notes about this setting, and I think that is really cool and fun. So I think that'll do it for right now for this world building session. Thank you so much, Patrick Haggerty and Solari71, for your advice. You really helped a huge amount, and that's not sarcasm. That was really cool. Thank you very much. I might come back to this next week to flesh out more details, but I'll also post about this on the Discord. So if you want to head over to geekarchaeology.com, you can jump in our Discord, and hopefully we'll have more discussions about this and add more detail to this over the next few weeks. And then hopefully I will run a D&D campaign in this world. So that would be a lot of fun. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you for your help. And see you next time around. Take care.